If you were to tell me in 2015 that Pixar would have one of the most catastrophic downfalls in cinema history, I would have laughed in your face. Seriously, you're telling me that the studio that turned toys, fish, even cars into heart-wrenching stories that somehow made you laugh, cry, and rethink life all at once now can't break even at the box office? Yes, as unbelievable as it sounds, it's unfortunately true, and Pixar has turned into something unrecognizable. Elemental lost them billions, Lightyear was an embarrassment, and don't even get me started on Elio. Even their better recent movies still don't even come close to the Pixar we used to know and love, but why? Now, I'm sure we've all heard the countless theories, right? They changed the art style, too many sequels, it's all Disney's fault. I mean, people have been trying to pin down what exactly went wrong with Pixar for years, but what if I told you that they're all wrong? That there is something much bigger and darker going on here, something that no one is talking about. You see, as a longtime Pixar fan, I have spent way too much time thinking about this problem, and I think that I finally figured it out. There's a pattern in their recent films, a thread running through each one of them. It's subtle at first, easy to overlook, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Pixar has become obsessed with something so much darker and so much heavier than you even realize. Trauma. Yeah, deep, gut-level trauma. Now, before you roll your eyes and say, well, Pixar has been emotional since the beginning, Up alone made us all sob in the first 10 minutes. But trust me, this is not the same thing in the slightest. I'm not talking about the occasional tearing up moment or the emotional montage before the end of the movie, no. I'm talking about deep psychological issues like generational trauma, midlife crises, complex mental health problems. These heavy-duty themes have become the main point of every recent Pixar movie. The studio known for asking whimsical questions like, what if toys had feelings and what if rats could cook, now seems fixated on what if a socially awkward 13-year-old boy had trauma. Seriously, think about it. Nearly every single recent Pixar movie has put some sort of emotional baggage or psychological pain at the center of its plot. Inside Out wasn't just a movie about emotions, it was a film about a young girl's internal battle with depression. Turning Red wasn't just a story about puberty, it was a film about cultural and generational trauma. There is just something different about how recent Pixar movies handle emotion. It's no longer just an element in the story, it is the story, and I'm here to tell you exactly why I think this is where Pixar went wrong. And I know that might sound far-fetched and hard to believe, but trust me when I say this has gotten out of control, and I haven't seen a single other person talking about it. So, ladies and gentlemen, in this video, I'm gonna show you exactly how this obsession with trauma changed Pixar, why it's costing them their audience, and why the magic we all fell in love with is at risk of disappearing entirely. And trust me, by the end of this video, you're gonna see Pixar in a way that you have never ever seen before. To appreciate how drastically Pixar has changed, we have to go back and remember what made their early films so special. From the very beginning, Pixar wasn't just about pushing boundaries in animation technology, they were about crafting heartfelt stories that appealed to audiences of all ages. Stories that the world had never seen before, and these premises were often out-of-the-world imaginative, asking questions like, what if toys were secretly alive and had feelings? What if monsters in your closet were actually running a scare factory? What if a clownfish got lost in the ocean? These ideas were whimsical, entertaining, and immediately intriguing. Kids found them fun, and adults found them clever and original. Yet within these premises, Pixar managed to mix in these moments of profound emotional depth. The kind of moments that would take you by surprise the first time watching. You never expected these silly kids films to have these complex and deep messages within them. Now, I know it sounds like I'm contradicting myself after ranting about how Pixar's obsession with trauma is ruining their movies, so why am I now saying it was one of the best things about their classics? Because here's the thing, the way that these old movies used to handle emotions versus the way that the new movies do it now, it's not even in the same universe. I think the best way to explain this is by breaking down some of these classics so that you can see how they used to use emotion compared to now, and I have to warn you, once you see how far they've taken things, it's honestly quite shocking. But there's your warning, take it as you will. When Toy Story was released in 1995, it wasn't just another animated movie, it was a cultural milestone. On the surface, it's a simple story about toys coming to life, but the brilliance lies in how it balances heart and humor. humor. Unlike today's Pixar films that often feel weighed down by heavy trauma and psychological complexity, Toy Story demonstrates how both heart and humor can work together seamlessly, both strengthening the other rather than competing for screen time. The film starts off at Andy's surprise party, where we follow the toys as they spy on the kids through the baby monitor. The scene is packed with comedy. You have Rex panicking about being scary enough, Mr. Potato Head delivering snarky commentary, and then we see Woody, who seems to be the ringleader of the operation. He's funny and confident, but you notice that there is this tension beneath the surface. He is absolutely terrified of losing his place as Andy's favorite toy. Each comedic moment in this scene plays into that deeper emotional truth that every toy is scared of losing their place in Andy's life. And this is a feeling that everyone has experienced. I mean, who hasn't felt afraid of being replaced or forgotten? What's fascinating is just how effortlessly this scene then switches tone. As Sarge is listing off Andy's birthday presents from downstairs, a lunchbox, bed sheets, battleship, there's a sense of relief from the toys that you can literally feel through the screen, until the last present is revealed. Buzz Lightyear. And this is where shit gets real. Immediately, Woody cannot stand Buzz and tries to put him down in every way possible. He makes fun of his lasers and wings, he rolls his eyes whenever Buzz speaks. But underneath it all, Woody is just genuinely anxious about being replaced. Things only get worse when we realize that Buzz thinks he's a real space ranger and not a toy, which just adds fuel to Woody's rage. Woody takes more digs at Buzz, telling him that he's just a stupid toy, to which Buzz responds by throwing himself around the bloody room in a way that makes it look like he's kind of flying. Of course, all the toys go absolutely mental for him, which just intensifies Woody's jealousy and makes Buzz's eventual downfall much more devastating. What I love about this movie is that it doesn't spell it out for you or have Woody crying in the corner talking about his anxiety. Instead, we're shown this feeling through the comedic jealousy in Buzz and Woody's relationship. Even the visuals in Andy's room tell the story. Woody's Western posters get covered up with Buzz Lightyear posters. The bed sheets switch from cowboy to space ranger. Not only are these details funny because they show how over the top Andy's obsession is, but it also creates genuine sympathy for Woody without making him into a victim. As the story progresses, we see Woody's rage just intensify, and he starts to find subtle ways in which he can get rid of Buzz and get his spot back. He decides that he's going to use the RC car to knock Buzz behind the desk so that Andy can take him to Pizza Planet instead. But unfortunately, this plan goes terribly wrong and he ends up accidentally knocking Buzz straight out the window. Another thing I love about this movie is that not only does it let comedy drive the story, but it also lets us see how emotions sort of intensify over time. It shows how jealousy can make someone act out impulsively, lashing out in ways that they never normally would. When you think about it, I feel like kids' movies today are afraid to have that sort of protagonist that acts out and makes mistakes, even though it is such a human experience. I feel like studios are just too cautious nowadays to add in these themes to their movies, so they focus on victimizing their main characters and having things happen to them instead. But I just love how this movie shows his mistakes in a way that holds him responsible but doesn't make him out to be the villain. It is just peak cinema. So after this near fatal accident, Woody tries to convince the other toys that it was just a mistake, but after seeing Woody's recent jealousy, the toys come to the conclusion that Woody murdered Buzz on purpose. Given how loyal the toys were to Woody, this just adds a whole nother layer onto this feeling of being replaced, not just by Andy, but now by his friends. Even as I'm explaining all of this, I didn't realize how deep Toy Story actually was, and I think it's because it has that perfect balance of heart and humor. Every emotional moment falls perfectly in the story and it leads to the main adventure. So what do you know? Buzz ends up being completely fine and manages to get in the car with Woody and Andy for a fun outing at Pizza Planet. But of course, Buzz is absolutely raging at the fact that Woody just tried to end his life, so they get into a huge fight. All that tension between them has led to this point and they are just going absolutely ham on each other until they suddenly realize that the car has left without them. Annoyingly, they now realize that they're gonna have to work together if they want to get back safely to Andy, which just really bothers the both of them. I wanted to quickly shift into Buzz's character development now because I feel like his arc is so underrated. Somehow they both luckily made it to Pizza Planet, and whilst Woody is trying to look for Andy, Buzz gets distracted by this claw machine which looks like a spaceship. Remember, at this point he still thinks he's a space ranger, so he climbs into the claw machine hoping it can take him home, which is honestly so sad. Of course it doesn't take him home, but instead puts him in the hands of Sid. Sid is Andy's terrifying neighbor whose favorite pastime is torturing innocent toys. A kid's movie, by the way. Sid's house is even worse than you can imagine, and Sid's mutant toys set up the scene with a mix of comedy and mild horror. I'm not joking when I say this absolutely terrified me as a kid. But surprisingly, what follows next is one of the most moving scenes in the entire movie. As Buzz slowly creeps past the living room, he catches a glimpse of a commercial on TV. Suddenly, the comedy stops as he realizes what he's looking at. Buzz Lightyear action figures flood the screen, and in that moment, everything he thought about himself was a lie. There is no way after everything he is just a toy after all. In an act of desperation, Buzz tries to fly out the window to prove that this commercial is a lie and that he's not just a toy. Of course, this doesn't work, and he ends up crashing down on the floor and loses his arm, which signifies that he really is just a toy. It is a gut punch of a moment. Buzz has just lost all sense of identity and he doesn't know who he is anymore. But the scene doesn't wallow in despair and is followed by Sid's sister taking Buzz and making him join her tea party. Yeah, mid-mental breakdown, Buzz gets dressed up all in a cute little outfit and renamed as Mrs. Nesbit. This balance perfectly ensures that sadness doesn't linger too long. We feel Buzz's disappointment deeply, but we're also allowed to laugh through it, which makes the emotion digestible for kids. Look, I'm not gonna sit here and break down every point of the movie, but the point is, every emotional moment in Toy Story serves to forward the story's momentum. Woody's guilt and longing for friendship drive him to rescue Buzz, leading to that thrilling climax where they fly in the sky. The reason why that scene is so iconic is because the film earns that emotional high. We've seen the characters go through their ups and downs, which makes their friendship at the end feel so real and deserved. The point is, Pixar earned our tears through their storytelling, not by making the trauma the entire point of the story, if that makes sense. Before we look at the ridiculous ways that Pixar recently has been handling emotion, I want to go over a few more shorter examples just so that you can really understand this balance. Right from the start, Finding Nemo hits us with deep emotion. Marlin's shock and grief as he loses his wife and almost all of their eggs is devastating. But the movie doesn't stay in that sadness. After the intense opening, it shifts into a colorful, funny adventure that still carries that weight of the loss beneath the surface. Marlin's overprotectiveness as a dad and Nemo's desire for independence both come from that early trauma, but these emotional backstories only exist to set the stakes of the movie and move the story forward. The plot isn't about Marlin's trauma, it's about the journey across the ocean to find Nemo who ran away. Yes, you can see how his grief affects the decisions that he makes, but it doesn't take over the story. You never sit through a long drawn out scene of his sadness, instead you feel it through his actions, through how he reacts to situations. Pixar trusts the audience to connect the dots emotionally, rather than forcing the emotion on them in every point of the story. Take Marlin meeting Dory for example. Her constant forgetfulness and cheerful outlook are funny, but they also highlight Marlin's grief and anxiety without turning the film into this deep therapy session. Scenes like the jellyfish escape are tense and exciting adventures. Marlin's fears raise the stakes, but the story still remains focused on the quest to find Nemo rather than lingering on his trauma. When that reunion finally does happen, it feels earned. Not because the story has been forcing emotion on us the entire time, but because it's the natural conclusion of the adventure. That's the key difference. In classic Pixar, the emotional beats support the story, but they don't become the story itself. They raise the stakes, deepen the characters, and make the adventure worth it, but they don't overwhelm it. And that balance is exactly what's missing in post-2015 Pixar films that are obsessed with trauma, where the emotional struggle becomes the plot itself. itself. Lastly, I wanted to quickly touch on the film Up because people say that it's the saddest Pixar film of all time, but guys, this movie still follows that same principle. By now, everyone knows the famous opening montage showing Carl and Ellie's life together up until her death. It's beautiful, devastating, and makes me cry every time I watch it. But, and this is important, that heartbreak isn't the story itself, it's just the setup for the adventure. Carl's heartbreak motivates him, but the story doesn't linger on his grief, it uses it instead. His loss gives the floating house, the balloon idea, and the journey to Paradise Falls meaning and stakes. Right after the montage, Carl meets Russell, and the story immediately shifts into adventure mode. A talking dog, dangerous cliffs, crazy villains, and exotic locations. The emotional weight is still there, and it shapes Carl's choices and fuels his obsession, but it doesn't stop the plot. Then there's the ending, where Carl finally lets go of his house. It hits hard emotionally, but it's also the resolution of the story. He's no longer clinging onto the past, he's ready to live in the present and connect with Russell. That moment is heartbreaking, yet it works perfectly because it emerges naturally from the adventure, not from dwelling on grief for the entire film. The film proves that you can handle deep and emotional moments without letting them take over the narrative. Looking back on these films, I noticed that pretty much all of them explored universal feelings. Toy Story explored the fear of being forgotten and replaced, Finding Nemo explored the fear of letting go, and Up explored living with grief. These are themes that the average person has felt and experienced, but what I find fascinating is how they take these very human experiences and put them into these crazy fantasy worlds. What do you mean I'm crying over a group of talking toys because I know exactly how they feel? So that's the Pixar we all knew and loved, filled with heart, humor, and unforgettable stories that we thought would last forever. Until 2015 came along and suddenly everything felt different. Now, don't get me wrong, Pixar's recent films still have emotion. Oh boy, do they have emotion, but something is different. The balance feels off. So, ladies and gentlemen, take a deep breath in, deep breath out, because we are about to enter Pixar's trauma-obsessed era. At some point in the 2010s, Pixar's storytelling took a hard turn inwards, and I mean straight into the realm of therapy and psychological issues. You can almost pinpoint the exact moment this happened in 2015 with the release of their movie Inside Out. Now, don't get me wrong, Inside Out is a masterpiece in many different ways and was rightly adored by critics and audiences. It's a wildly imaginative film, and it deals with complex ideas about emotions, memory, and mental health. Instead of asking the playful what-if questions that Pixar were known for, like what if toys had feelings, Inside Out went down a very different route. They asked, what if feelings have feelings? What if we could see what was going on inside a kid's head during a tough time? It was a bold shift. I mean, instead of bringing toys or animals to life, the film gave personality to abstract feelings, anger, joy, sadness, and so on. Those weren't just for laughs. The whole movie used these personified emotions to explore Riley's inner world, turning her journey into a metaphor for coping with depression and learning that it's okay to be sad. Inside Out was Pixar's big return to originality after a few years of constant sequels and bad originals like The Good Dinosaur. It made audiences of all ages laugh, cry, and reflect on their own feelings. But looking back, it also marked the start of Pixar's obsession with trauma. The film put a character's inner emotional struggle front and center, making it the driving force of the story rather than just a part of it. This approach became a blueprint for Pixar's later films, which focused heavily on psychological issues and centered their plot around resolving these deep emotional wounds, sometimes at the expense of fun and adventure. This all started pretty lighthearted at first, with movies like Finding Dory. Although the movie seems like a simple, fun sequel to Finding Nemo, the core of the story is really about Dory dealing with memory loss and the trauma of being separated from her parents as a child. The movie spends a lot of time on her anxiety and scattered memories, but they throw in some moments of comedy in an attempt to balance it out. It wasn't a bad movie, but you can definitely tell that this was Pixar's way of testing the waters without really going full deep into it. Then we move on to Coco, which is just a beautiful film and honestly one of the best from this Pixar era. This story follows a young boy named Miguel who dreams of becoming a musician, but his family banned music after Miguel's great-great-grandmother Coco was abandoned by her musician father. The story mixes adventure and stunning visuals with a heartfelt story about generational trauma. What's interesting is that the conflict in this story isn't an external villain, it's the family's own traumatic past that drives the story. But since this type of inward storytelling was still really new for Pixar, this worked really well for them, and honestly, I'm not joking when I say it is one of my favorite animated movies of all time. But here's where things started to change, and it can all be tied back to one very dramatic change of leadership. For the first 2 decades of Pixar's history, the studio was led by a group of talented men: John Lasseter, Andrew Stanton, Pete Docter, Lee Unkrich, and Brad Bird. These guys were the real deal, and they oversaw and directed all the original classics with the instinct of entertain first and let emotions in second. That old message is very important. John Lasseter especially was an absolute beast when it came to these stories, and he directed so many hits such as Toy Story, A Bug's Life, Cars, and many, many more. However, in 2017, Pixar went through some very complicated issues and had to make some quick changes. John Lasseter, who was then essentially the Disney Pixar animation chief, was dropped from the company following allegations of inappropriate workplace behavior. Lasseter's exit was huge. I mean, love him or hate him, I mean, you should probably hate him after that, but he was the guy keeping Pixar's identity alive. After he left, Pixar appointed Pete Docter as the new chief creative officer in 2018. Pete was also one of the founding fathers of Pixar and directed classics such as Monsters Inc., Up, and Inside Out. He was known for being one of the more thoughtful and heart-oriented directors at Pixar, so when he got full control, he went full into these emotional-centered stories. This is when things really start to get out of control, so let's dive into some of these bizarre, trauma-obsessed movies, shall we? Starting off with Onward, which was Pixar's first original after Lasseter left the company, and this movie really wears its trauma on its sleeve. The film itself is actually a little confusing, but all you need to know is that this takes place in a fantasy world, but they live normal, mundane lives. It's like if our world just randomly had dragons and magic, but no one really cared about it. So the story follows 2 elf brothers, Ian and Barley, who lost their father at a very young age. On Ian's 16th birthday, their mother gives them this magical gift, which has the power to bring their dad back for 24 hours. Ian tries the spell and partially succeeds, but only the lower half of their dad's body appears before the magic fizzles out. This sets up the central quest of the story. The brothers have just 24 hours to find another Phoenix gem, to finish the spell, and spend 1 full day with their dad. So they embark on this quest, and their journey takes them through a series of magical yet modern settings. I'm not gonna lie, the adventure in this movie is so unbelievably boring. I mean, it makes sense that most people don't know about this movie, so I'm just gonna skip ahead. By the climax, Ian realizes that Barley has always been the father figure he needed, teaching him how to drive, encouraging him, and being there for him in ways that their actual dad never could. In the final moments, Ian chooses to let Barley have the last 5 minutes with their dad while he fights off this stone dragon or something, I don't know. But he accepts that what he truly needed wasn't closure with his father, but appreciation for the relationship that he already had. It's a really emotional, sweet message, but I'm sorry, but this film just feels so off. Sure, the emotional moments hit hard, but the adventure around them often feels secondary. It's almost as if the filmmakers started with the idea, let's make people cry over a lost dad, and then built the quest around that. There is actually a really perfect explanation as to why the film felt this way, but I will get to that later in this video, I promise. Let's move on to some of the better films of this era, and let's start with my personal favorite, which is Soul. Now, I know that I've been talking just crazy about the movies from this era, but trust me when I say, just because I like these movies doesn't mean that their structure is Not how it used to be. Not everyone likes these movies, let's just say that. Soul introduced Pixar's first black lead and had a wildly ambitious concept. Unlike other Pixar films, it's less about trauma and more about asking an existential question of what happens if someone dies without fulfilling their dreams. The story explores purpose, regret, and what it really means to live. It's not about childhood struggles, it's more like a midlife psychological drama in the form of a family-friendly cartoon. Yes, there's humor and adventure, but the emotional point of the story is very grown up, so much so that it might even be a little too heavy for kids. I mean, when you think about it, what kid is gonna understand struggling to find the meaning of life? By the end of the movie, the climax isn't about beating a villain or solving an external problem. It's about Joe realizing the importance of enjoying life's small moments. It's a beautiful idea, but it's philosophical and abstract, more like an art house film than a traditional Pixar adventure. For me, personally, it's in my top 4 favorite films on Letterboxd, but I can understand why it might be a little bit too deep for kids, and that's why it didn't really resonate with audiences. Moving on now to Luca, which definitely stands out from Pixar's recent films. It's a light, easygoing, coming-of-age story focused on friendship and learning to accept yourself. The trauma is mild, mostly Luca worrying about getting in trouble or being outed as a sea monster, which is definitely just an underlying metaphor for struggles with identity and prejudice, but Lucas steers clear of heavy trauma dumping or deep psychological angst. That is probably why a lot of viewers found it refreshing, because it felt like the low-stakes Pixar movies that we used to know, but sadly, this was Pixar's last movie that wasn't drowning in trauma. From here, they decided to jump in headfirst, and they never looked back. Turning Red is a perfect example of this shift, with its plot centering around intergenerational trauma and the emotional minefield of adolescence. The story follows a 13-year-old May who transforms into a giant red panda whenever she gets emotional, which is really just a metaphor for puberty and the inherited emotional baggage from her family, specifically the women in her family. The heart of this story is about generational trauma as we follow May and her mother Ming's strained relationship, and then we soon realize that her mother Ming also had a complicated bond with her own mother. The red panda curse represents all the pressure, expectations, and unspoken feelings that have been handed down through the generations. The climax isn't a battle with a villain, it's literally a tearful argument between mother and daughter in this astral plane of the soul where they must reconcile their traumas. May helps her mother heal her inner teen, and they all come to terms with imperfection and empathy across generations. It's basically just like you're watching one big therapy session, but I mean, that's just what Pixar is now. It's no longer just whatever rat could cook in Paris, it's whatever Chinese Canadian teen could break a cycle of generational trauma. Now, I'm not saying that Turning Red was a bad movie. It deserves credit for breaking new ground. It talks about puberty and periods in a way that Disney had never done before. And many viewers, especially young women and people from immigrant families, found the movie to be deeply personal and relatable. But for a lot of other viewers, Turning Red just didn't click, and look, I kind of get it. While I personally love diving into all kinds of stories and learning about different cultures and experiences, not everyone can connect with a story about a 13-year-old girl navigating puberty and a tense mother-daughter relationship. And I know that might sound selfish, but it was one of the main complaints about the film. People just couldn't relate to May's specific emotional world. Like we talked about before, the emotional themes in Pixar's older movies were way more universal, exploring themes of grief and being forgotten. I am not saying that people will automatically hate a movie just because they haven't experienced it. In fact, Coco is one of the most beloved Pixar films of recent years, and that too is about generational trauma. But do you want to know why I think Coco had a better reception than Turning Red, other than the fact that I think Coco has a better story? It's the fact that in the 5 years between these two movies, Disney Pixar released 3 movies about generational trauma. 3 whole movies. You have Onward, Encanto, and Strange World. So you have 5 generational trauma movies in, what, 5 to 6 years? That's insane. It's like Pixar has made it their mission to dig up all these old family wounds for their plot, and honestly, it is a pretty striking difference from the playful, adventurous Pixar movies that we used to know. But like I said, there is a big reason for this shift, which we will get to later in this video. Stick with me now. Elemental pretty much demonstrates everything that has become formulaic about Pixar's recent approach. On the surface, it's a whimsical romance between fire and water characters in a world made entirely of human-like elements. Such a fun idea, right? But underneath, the story is mainly about immigrant family struggles and, of course, you guessed it, generational trauma. Seriously, what is going on here? Ember, the fire protagonist, is weighed down by her duty to take over her immigrant father's shop and the pressure to not let her parents down. There is also a prejudice angle where the fire people are discriminated against in the Element City. So whilst Elemental has a cute opposites attract love story, the core is really about guilt, family pressure, societal bias, and internalized anger. Elemental absolutely tanked at the box office, and I mean had the worst opening weekend in Pixar history. Well, that was until Elio came along and broke that record. Some people blamed poor marketing or the fact that families are now trained by Disney to wait for these Pixar releases to come out on Disney Plus, since Luca, Soul, and Turning Red all went straight to streaming. But content-wise, Elemental didn't land with a lot of people because it felt both predictable and kind of preachy. It was so focused on its messages of follow your own path and let your feelings flow that the imaginative potential of an element world completely took a back seat. Also, the world's internal logic was just all over the place, with things like fire only burning some things and not others, indicating that perhaps the story team cared more about the metaphorical significance than the actual world building. In short, it tried to make you cry and shove a lesson down your throat, but it forgot to make you truly care or have fun in the process. And guys, I'm not even going to touch on Elio because I made a whole separate video on it, so if you want to see that, I suggest you go and watch it, but it basically just follows everything I've talked about today. Okay, that is a lot of movies and a lot of trauma, but as you can see, all of these movies follow the same pattern throughout. Pixar's recent originals and even some sequels frequently revolve around a central emotional wound that must be healed or a psychological lesson that the character must learn. Like I said before, it's literally like they start with the trauma that they want to tell and then build the world around that. Instead of a villain to defeat or an external goal to reach, the climax is typically an emotional epiphany, accepting a loss, embracing sadness, forgiving a parent, finding self-worth, etc. It's as if Pixar's writers collectively got psychology degrees and decided that every single protagonist needs to now go through therapy sessions. And I do not want people to jump in the comments and start saying, oh, you just hate movies you can't relate to, Number one, you don't know my story, you don't know what I've been through. Number two, if you did know me, you would know that I absolutely love stories about different things and cultures that I haven't learned about. But my point is, I just don't like stories where it feels like the plot solely exists just to deliver a message instead of letting it grow naturally from the characters and the events. Let me break down exactly what I mean by this so people don't get confused, and I will use Turning Red as an example. Turning Red builds almost everything around showing generational trauma and the mother and daughter's dynamic. Even the giant red panda exists purely as a symbol. May's panda represents her repressed emotions, and her mother's panda represents the overwhelming weight of parental expectations. This is all fine, I guess, but something I really disliked about the film and about recent Pixar films is how in the final confrontation, they literally spell out the message of the film within the dialogue, which I just hate. Compare that to the end of Finding Nemo. Marlin doesn't just stand there and say, I'm sorry I was overprotective, I've learned to let go now. He simply just demonstrates it by letting Nemo go and do something risky. And the audience just gets it naturally, no on-the-nose explanation required, because we are not idiots. That's the difference. One movie demonstrates its heart through its story, and the other literally spells it out for you because its story isn't strong enough to tell it itself. Basically, recent films have become way less subtle and more literal in handling themes. It wants to talk about the issue out loud and center stage, whether it's generational trauma, mental health, identity, etc. But early Pixar dealt with these big feelings too, but more through metaphor and subtext woven into a straightforward plot. Now, now the metaphor is the plot, and sometimes it's not even a metaphor anymore, it's just a straight up explanation. Turning Red came pretty damn close to just screaming we have generational trauma outright, and this can make movies feel just a little bit shallow and preachy. I know that all of this might sound like I'm being a little overdramatic and reaching for a problem. I mean, a studio telling more personal issue-driven stories. In theory, there is nothing wrong with that. So the real question is, why has it contributed to Pixar's decline? Why aren't audiences connecting with these trauma-centric films like they did with the old ones? One of the main issues I have with the recent films is that I just don't think they're as fun as the classics. The old movies balanced adventure, laughs, and imagination with emotional beats, but when a story is built around these heavy themes, the tone can get really weighed down. Take Soul for example. It's funny at times thanks to the whole Freaky Friday souls in a different body plotline, but in general it's more of a quiet philosophical film. Kids that went in there expecting a lively jazz adventure got out there discussions about purpose instead. Onward has laughs and action, but the whole quest feels shadowed by loss. Turning Red is energetic and funny, but the intense mother-daughter conflict can feel uncomfortable for some viewers. Lightyear was criticized for being surprisingly serious, and Elemental focused on family pressure and societal prejudice instead of embracing its element-based creativity. Even when comedy is present, it can clash with the emotional weight of the film, like the dad's half body in Onward. The result is movies that feel more like emotional homework rather than fun entertainment. Adults may enjoy the depth, but kids might lose interest, and I feel like that's a huge reason why parents now hesitate to take their kids to the cinema to watch these films. Pixar used to make a name for itself by breaking formulas. Every movie felt fresh and exciting, but ironically, Pixar now has a formula, and audiences have started to notice. There is a running joke among animation fans that Pixar wants to make you cry every time, and at first this felt really natural, but it just now feels very calculated. You sit down to watch a new Pixar film, and within 10 minutes you often get a dead family member, a sad flashback, or a big lesson teased out. So in a lot of cases, you already know the emotional beats coming. You can tell exactly how the story ends because you've seen it time and time before. Elemental opens talking about Ember's immigrant family and their struggles, so we can guess by the end of the film she'll find her own path and her dad will learn to accept it. Turning Red from the get-go establishes the strict mother-daughter dynamic. Anyone who's seen a coming-of-age film can guess that the climax will involve some big fight, hurt feelings, and then a moment when they make up where her mum realizes her mistake. Lo and behold, that is precisely the movie's arc, with a panda added in for a little bit of fun. I can't be the only one who has started to tune out of these movies because it just feels so formulaic now. The studio's reliance on these trauma-obsessed structures has become its own trope, and we're just seeing the same movies over and over again. It also doesn't help that it feels like Pixar fired their entire creative team, because has anyone else noticed that most of their recent films focus on just regular humans? Back in the day, they made movies about talking bugs, toys, and even rats. Now it's basically anxious kid deals with life over and over and over again. Even the titles have become less imaginative. I mean, you have Luca, Coco, Elio. I mean, you could literally swap these titles around and you wouldn't know because they give no inclination as to what the movie's actually about. It's so weird. Another point is that it just feels like Pixar doesn't know who they're making these movies for anymore. Are these films deep adult-focused stories, fun adventures for kids, or trying to do both like before? That balance used to feel effortless, and now it just feels so shaky. Turning Red and Elemental look kid-friendly in style and humor, but their themes hit harder for a more mature audience. I feel like Lightyear aimed at older Toy Story fans with its serious tone and nostalgia, but kids expecting the goofy buzz were left so disappointed. So I feel like this trauma-heavy approach to storytelling is fine for mature viewers, but fails to hold the attention of restless 5-year-olds. It almost feels like every new release should come with a warning label. Is this movie okay for my kids? Will they enjoy it or will they fall asleep? Is the message something they'll actually understand or care about? I hands down believe that this hesitation is such a big reason why these movies aren't performing as well in the box office, because back in the day when you had movies like Toy Story and Finding Nemo, everyone knew what these movies were were about, they knew it was suitable for all ages. And I feel like this all just comes back to Pixar trying to replicate their last big blockbuster, which in my opinion was Inside Out. So because that movie was hailed as an important film about mental health, perhaps Pixar felt that every good movie had to mean something profound. This was also the moment when Pete Docter came in charge, and after doing some digging, I think I have found the exact reason why these films feel so trauma-centered. And guys, this is crazy. As soon as Pete steps up, he comes into the position with a plan, and that plan was, of course, to try and replicate Inside Out's success, and the way to do that was to tell meaningful stories. He thought that the best way to do this was by giving opportunities to a bunch of younger directors from diverse backgrounds, which is fantastic from a representation standpoint, and it brought fresh voices. But these filmmakers often brought their own personal stories to the table and built the story based on that. Domi Shi, director of Turning Red, drew directly from her life as a Chinese immigrant's daughter. Dan Scanlon, director of Onward, literally told a story processing his own childhood loss. Enrico Casarosa, director of Luca, based it on his own memories of childhood summers in Italy and his close friendships, not traumatic, but personal and nostalgic. And Adrian Molina, co-director of Coco and creator of Elio. He infused his Mexican heritage and cultural perspective into each of these stories. Whilst there is nothing wrong with telling personal stories, I do feel like this is the reason why it can feel less creative, because like I said before, they are literally starting from the trauma and building out from there. And I can't even tell you how different this is from how Pixar used to come up with their ideas. They didn't start with a theme or a moral, they started by asking a crazy out there what if question. What if cars were alive and had feelings? What if we show a relationship between a lonely old man and a Boy Scout? And these creative ideas would just come from passing conversations in the office. The story grew from that initial question, and the emotions, themes, and lessons emerged naturally along the way. That's part of the reason why these movies felt so effortless and magical, because you never felt like they were trying to hit that emotional note. I found this fascinating essay the other day, written by Parul Segal, called The Case Against the Trauma Plot. It points out that modern stories across books, TV, and film have become obsessed with trauma to the point it's cliche. Writers and filmmakers will use a character's traumatic past to drive the story, assuming that it automatically makes the character deep or the story meaningful. But Parul argues that this trend can often flatten characters, reducing them to just a bundle of symptoms or a sob story rather than actually deepen them. The story ends up focusing more on unpacking the trauma than what the characters actually do in the present. Reading that, I couldn't help but think of Pixar's recent movies. It's like we're meant to care about the character because of their trauma and not because they're interesting or likable from the start. For instance, would Onward's Ian and Barley have been as sympathetic if not for the dead dad plotline? The film barely develops them as characters beyond that loss and their sibling dynamic. May in Turning Red is definitely a fun character, but the movie heavily leans on her conflict with her mum to shape her arc. Remove the generational trauma aspect and what's left? A much lighter movie about a girl who turns into a panda and loves boy bands, which frankly would be a fun movie on its own. And I feel like that ties into the bigger thing I'm trying to say, because it feels like Pixar is reluctant to make stories that are more lighthearted and don't have a big emotional moment, which sometimes it's okay. It's okay to not tell a story that has this huge emotional tearful arc. I mean, just look at classics like Monsters Inc., Ratatouille, or Cars. They're heartfelt and fun without having therapy level stakes. There are countless interviews where Pixar artists will say, "We try to make it personal," and that has been a mantra since the company's beginning, but it seems that since 2015, personal has shifted into autobiographical story. And sometimes that works amazing in stories like Coco, but when every movie follows that same personal realism, it can feel so repetitive. This is something Pete Docter himself recently acknowledged, and get ready for this because this is crazy. So in a 2024 interview, Pete acknowledged the recent criticisms of the company and noted that going forward, Pixar will focus on stories with clear mass appeal that are grounded in universal experiences. He said that he understands that movies like Turning Red and Luca didn't play as strongly with audiences, and that from now on, he wants themes that everyone can feel, rather than highly specific autobiographical tales. Which, hello, this is insane. This is literally the head of the studio acknowledging everything I've said in this video. But do I really think Pixar Pixar will make a change to their upcoming stories. I guess we'll see. I did just want to make another point in this video to say that this absolutely has nothing to do with the specific themes of this movie and the directors themselves. Many of the new Pixar directors come from backgrounds or identities that haven't been represented much historically. When given a chance to tell their story, it's natural that they might gravitate towards their own struggles and conflicts that they know well because they finally have a big platform to explore them in a movie. There is literally nothing wrong with that. So the entire point I'm trying to make in this video is that I feel like it's just this new formulaic way of storytelling where they start from the trauma and then build outwards. That said, I just want to finish this video by saying that Pixar isn't bad now. I just feel like they're going through a bit of a rough patch. In my opinion, I feel like Elio was the complete rock bottom, so at least they can only go up from here, I hope. It'll be interesting to see whether the pendulum swings completely the other way and they make their movies too safe and shallow. Ideally, Pixar just needs to find that sweet spot where they can tell their stories in the delightful, meaningful way that they used to do. So Pixar, if somehow you're hearing this, sometimes a toy's feelings can say more than 1,000 trauma plots, and I really do hope that you can get back to where you used to be because I miss you. Anyway, that is the end of today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment down below what you think about this whole situation, and I can't wait to have debates and friendly conversations with you in the comments. And if you made it this far, comment the word Nemo so I can see who made it to the end of this slightly longer video. Thank you guys so much. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!